Welcome to the Coach Doctor podcast, a podcast where we discuss aspects of sports coaching from grassroots to grandstands. I'm your host, James Barkell, and on this podcast, we hear from academics who research coaching. We talk to coaches on the front line from development levels through to professional coaches, and we discuss other elements of successful sporting programs with experts and practitioners from a range of sports science fields, motivational psychology, strength and conditioning, and many other elements required for successful performance. If you'd like to know more about what we do at the Coach Doctor, you can visit our website, thecoachdoctor.com.au, and learn more about our services, or follow me on Instagram at thecoachdr or Twitter at James_Barkell for more regular information. Today's guest is Professor Nicola Hodges. She's the Director of the Motor Skills Laboratory within the School of Kinesiology at the University of British Columbia, Vancouver, Canada. Nicola's field of research is in behavioural science, motor control and learning, and sports psychology. She has over 150 published journal articles, book chapters, and edited books, and has been cited over 7,000 times by other academics, including myself. She is considered an expert in the field of skill acquisition and examines practice variables such as demonstrations, instructions, feedback, and practice organisation, and investigates their impact on motor learning and transfer. She also studies expert athletes, particularly to do with deliberate practice and talent development pathways, and the processes underpinning perceptual skills. Her most recent publication, an extended challenge-based framework for practice design in sports coaching, is the basis of our discussion today, and I'm really looking forward to getting down to the nuts and bolts of what challenge-based coaching looks like. Nikki, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you very much, James. Thanks for having me.
Could you please start off by giving us some of your background to who you are and what you're doing, and I guess your main areas of research as well?
Yes. So I'm Nicola Hodges. I am at the University of British Columbia in the School of Kinesiology there, where I run the Motor Skills Lab. I came to Canada in 1993, originally to do research on sport expertise. I specifically sought out Janet Starks, who was sort of pioneering research on sport expertise at the time. But my background was in psychology. So I came from a psychology department to kinesiology. And and in my undergrad, I studied psychology and got really interested in some of the research on expertise at the time about perceptual cognitive skills. And that led to a journey where now I'm a Canadian citizen and I've been at UBC as a professor since 2004. I run the Motor Skills Lab there, so we basically do research concerned with practice behaviours, how people learn motor skills, like fundamental research on sort of basic processes about motor learning, as well as studying more skilled performers, either in the lab, more sort of experimental techniques, or survey-based research looking at how skills development over long periods of time, particularly influenced by ideas about deliberate practice, which maybe we'll get into. Yeah, and I think that's sort of about sums up my research, at least sort of my background to date. I mostly do research and teaching. I've done a little bit of consultancy in the past, but that's the thing I do the most is in the lab.
Okay, great. So you just mentioned deliberate practice. Just for our listeners, what's the difference between deliberate practice and just normal everyday practice or play?
Yes. So deliberate practice, that was a term that was coined by Anders Ericsson. And the importance of deliberate practice is to get away from notions just that, I suppose, any type of practice is equivalent, and that it's more than just accruing lots of practice, but it's about accruing lots of purposeful, relevant practice designed to improve performance. And there has been a lot of discussion about what deliberate practice is and isn't, but fundamentally, it's not just going out and playing a game where there's no desire to improve performance. It's really practice designed to improve performance that, in its sort of strictest definition, has been designed by an expert in some way.
Mm-hmm.
So, somebody might go out in the backyard and think, okay, I'm doing this is going to make me better. To them, that's purposeful practice, but sort of deliberate practice it would have feedback by a coach. It would be more, designed by an expert.
Okay, great. So throughout the interview, I'm going to refer back to a paper that you've recently published with a colleague of yours, Keith Lowes. It's called An Extended Challenge-Based Framework for Practice Design in Sports Coaching. Sorry, getting my mouth around that. So what is the challenge-based framework?
So the challenge, our framework was based on a initial challenge point framework that was proposed by Mark Guadagnoli and Tim Lee in 2004, and that was published in the Journal of Motor Behaviour. And this paper was, I suppose, designed to sort of summarize some of the motor learning literature and offer a sort of conceptualization, a way of thinking about how to optimize practice for, importantly, learning, for retention of skills. And a lot of the impetus, I think, behind the paper was driven by a need to distinguish performance or what you see now in a practice session from learning, which is maybe what you would see at a later time point. And the performance in practice is influenced by many sort of temporary things or temporary variables, such as your motivation, the coach guidance, the instruction that's being given, fatigue. And if somebody is doing well or not doing so well, that doesn't translate that well in terms of what they're going to retain when you measure them at a subsequent time, particularly what they're going to retain if you measure them at a subsequent time in the competition environment. So the challenge point framework was designed to sort of highlight this distinction between performance and learning, and that there are trade-offs to be had. So if you're sort of at a high level of performance, if you're performing something you can already do, there's likely to be little learning going on because you're already doing something you can already do. You're showing performance at a high level. There's little new information to be gained from the environment. There's little stimulus sort of for learning. Things are predictable. There's a lack of uncertainty. And so the learning gain, or the room for improvement, is low. However, if you move outside of that, what sometimes referred to as more of a comfort zone, where you're already performing things you can already do, and now there's new information in the environment, that this is where you start to get into a zone where learning can happen and improvement can happen. The individual cares, their system cares, their nervous system cares when it gets information that is novel or unpredicted, when there's some sort of error in what you expect. Now there's this impetus for change. Now, of course, if performance starts to fall off, when you start to get into zones where there may be more errors, this might not feel that comfortable, and can have some costs in terms of your immediate performance, what you see in practice. But it's that sort of cost in some way that translates, this more effortful practice that translates to later learning benefits. So the optimal challenge point in the original framework was this point where learning is optimized. So there's sort of like this idea that 100% learning, and this is at a point where performance is not optimal. So practice starts to drop off. So that's the challenge point. And then we took that challenge point framework, which was from 2004. We've been using it to sort of think about our own learning designs for a research perspective, but also in any consultancy work, and thinking that how can we maybe make this more translatable for coaches and put it more in the sports arena, and then, as well as sort of expand on some of the concepts. So that was the purpose behind this recent 2022 paper in Journal of Sports Sciences on the extended challenge framework.
Okay. And within the challenge framework, you refer to nominal difficulty and functional difficulty. What is, firstly, nominal difficulty? And then secondly, what's functional difficulty?
Right, yes. So the terms nominal and functional difficulty were terms used in the 2004 paper. And the importance was with the challenge point framework was emphasizing the fact that it's about individualized challenge points. And so nominal difficulty, a nominal degree of challenge, is basically sort of how you might describe a particular skill. So, in figure skating, the axel jump is maybe one of the most difficult skills. Everyone agrees that that's a difficult skill. And it's a triple is more difficult than a double, and the axel is more difficult than the salcho. And functional difficulty is difficulty based on the individual. So what may be difficult for me in something like figure skating is obviously going to be very different to somebody who is expert at figure skating or has more experience and skill. So the idea being that when you consider manipulating difficulty in practice, you have to consider the individual skills at the time, what they call the functional difficulty for that individual. And of course, it's quite easy to manipulate difficulty for a novice and challenge, because there's so much that's going to be difficult and challenging and bring new information. In fact, you've probably got to watch the reverse where there's overload of information, and help people zone in on what's critical. But at the elite levels, then this idea of trying to get new information and challenge is really quite hard, I think, to conceptualize what challenges will look like and how they can be brought into practice as people become more and more skilled, because the functional difficulty now for that individual is relatively low for what would be a nominally high difficulty skill.
Okay. So just going back, if we wanted to summarize the challenge point idea, if we were to use the analogy of training in the gym, and I was to go and lift a weight that I found quite easy, and I did it numerous amounts of time over and over again, week after week, it wouldn't really develop much muscle. Whereas if I was to go and challenge myself by lifting a weight that was a lot more difficult or a lot heavier, that would be likely to develop more muscle compared to that lighter weight. But then on the other hand, if I lift something that's too heavy and I can't lift it at all, I'm achieving nothing. So we want to try and create a challenge that's going to stress the brain or the cognitive functioning to then go and improve and build on that skill. Am I sort of on the right track with that?
Yes, you're dead right there, James. And a few other people have used that analogy as well to weight training and the idea of sort of progressive overload, and moving just beyond one's current capabilities, outside this comfort zone. I think that analogy works well because people in a practice environment, particularly coaches and strength and conditioning specialists, they're used to that idea that, if you want to get growth, should we say, then you need to push the envelope.
Yeah.
So yes, I think that works well. And of course, if you push too far, then there will be failure. And I think that analogy also works well in terms of pushing challenges for learning. We refer to it in the extended challenge point paper of this sort of more punishing zone, where you don't want to have an environment set up where there will be little chance of success. And of course, knowing what that zone looks like is the art of coaching. But you want to be outside that punishing zone. You want to be in that zone where you're just outside perhaps what is more comfortable.
Yeah, okay. And I guess that leads me on to the next point. One of the things you discuss is motivational costs. What is an example of some motivational costs that can come from training where challenge might be too high? Or
yeah, I think when we were writing this paper, something that we wanted to bring into the challenge framework and these sort of thinking about design of practice was making sure that there was this lens on motivation, because of course if we're talking about bringing in challenges, then usually that co-occurs with increased chance of failures and errors, and we do know errors have costs, motivational costs, maybe in the short term, but obviously more worryingly in the long term. So the importance of motivation is really the importance of challenges is to figure out how to balance some of those motivational desires against perhaps potential costs of challenges. So it may be that if you're really in this growth or learning zone, that it is going to be limited in time. It may be sandwiched between activities that already work on skills that you're good at, that maintain and reinforce existing skills. And it also may mean that there's some appreciation for individual differences. You have athletes who perhaps are more or less confident at perhaps different times of the season, and how much you want to push that learning growth zone depending on confidence, and perhaps having motivational costs will vary depending on who the person is, the time in the season, how they're performing. So yes, that's the importance of motivation. Of course, at the other end as well, I suppose, if you can have, if the challenges are low, then I also think that there's a motivational cost, of course, boredom. If you continue to do things that you can already do. So moving into an optimal challenge zone doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to have decreased motivation. Of course, challenges are stimulating. We want to keep learning, we want to improve. And then I think it's just figuring out how to emphasize the long-term learning, making sure that the athletes understand that failures or errors are not going to determine whether they make the team for the next day, because you're in a growth period and actually you don't really care about what you see right now, but what you care about is what you're going to try and measure at consecutive time points across the season to make sure some growth and learning is happening. So I do think that conversation piece and the instruction piece about what are our goals for this part of the practice session, or what are our goals for this session generally, is extremely important in order to make sure that comfort with errors is properly interpreted and not misevaluated by the performer or the coach.
So basically, you have motivational costs. If something is too easy, athletes going to lack motivation because it's too easy. If it's too hard, it's going to potentially decrease motivation because they're going to feel like they can't, that they fail all the time. Mm-hmm. So we've got to get that. You referred to the challenge point. You've got to try and get the right challenge point when you're using this sort of framework in coaching, and it's really important for the coach to communicate why they're doing something, and the fact that it's not going to be something that they're going to be, potentially dropping a player because they made a few mistakes in training.
Absolutely, yeah. That appropriate communication and that sort of affective informational balance.
Yeah, okay, that's great. And secondly, you mentioned not all difficulties are equally beneficial for learning. Why might some difficulties be more appropriate than others?
So this also comes from some prior research and frameworks in the educational literature. Maybe you're familiar with the work of Robert Bjork and Elizabeth Bjork on desirable difficulties. And they also talk about this idea of difficulties having to be meaningful. I suppose in some ways it's probably quite intuitive to many coaches, but you could get people doing a drill and you can make it difficult a number of ways. You can bring in challenge to practice by speeding up something or getting people to do sort of two things at the same time, unless what you're doing is sort of mimicking in some way what will be needed when you test that individual under competition scenarios or in match play, then the difficulties are meaningless. There's many ways you can make things difficult, but unless it's the processes or the skills themselves are going to be required in the transfer environment, in competition or match play, then that difficulty is somewhat irrelevant. So if for example, a free throw shot doesn't have to be performed at a really high speed, why would you make the difficulty? You can increase the challenge of the task by making people perform the action really fast. Now that may actually have some other consequences of bringing new information into the environment, but that you wouldn't want to keep practicing at that level of difficulty because it's just not a difficulty that's meaningful to what would be required in transfer.
Okay, and an example. So let's use that free throw example. What would be an example of adding some difficulty that would be in line with the game? Would it maybe be adding pressure from players, like talking to the player taking the shot and putting pressure by trying to interfere with their mental thoughts while they're going through the process? Is that a more appropriate example of difficulty to add to a task?
Yeah, that would be a difficulty that should also satisfy that goal of transfer as well. So you're right. So if you are practicing under conditions that more closely mimic where the skill is going to be performed, then you're maximizing those goals of what is being retained will show up under those performance environments. So under heightened anxiety, potentially fatigue, as you mentioned, with people present and maybe who are also evaluative. Also, I mean, a free throw, it's been a while since I played basketball, but you usually get two shots. Is that, you get the first one. If you make the first one, maybe you get the second one. So maybe even keeping the sort of number of reps before, there's an interpolated activity, then maybe you end up, doing a dribbling drill or whatever, but before you come back and do the two shots again, and you only get the second shot if you make the first shot. So there are ways then of mimicking what's more likely to happen in the transfer environment. I mean, in terms of difficulty, so I suppose one way to think is if you're dealing with a new learner, it may just be too difficult, right? If the net is at its typical height, and a common way of manipulating difficulty is to change the height of the net if you can, and you do see scalable heights for equipment. So that would be a way of adapting the difficulty at an individualized level, so you're getting the appropriate functional difficulty. Okay. I suppose the ball size as well is another way you could play around with difficulty. Distance from the net. Distance from the net is a funny one on the free throw shot because, of course, it's always the same distance. But maybe there are tiny variations, that you can play around with in terms of distance.
Yeah. Okay. No, I think you've answered that really, really well. So I appreciate that. The last thing you referred to in this section of the paper, or you've talked about the three main points within the paper, is the dynamic nature of competitive environment, which makes for the optimum environment for providing difficulties. What do you mean in this sense, or have we just sort of answered that in the previous question?
If I understand your question correctly, I mean, I think many team sport environments are dynamic and constantly changing, so that you do want to have difficulties that are appropriately scaled to that dynamic environment. I know when we talk about the dynamic nature of difficulties in the paper, we're specifically talking about the need to continually evaluate the appropriate challenge, so that the sort of idea of a challenge point or challenge zone is a moving target for an individual. So, of course, we're not static. We keep improving, and so there's need to keep sort of revisiting the degree of challenge needed for growth and what that might be. So I suppose that's more the sort of reflection on what's the dynamic part of that question.
Okay. And you refer to the requirement for some uncertainty being required for practice to develop long-term success. So I think you use examples of, making some simple practice. Let's go back to the free throw example. If we've got a really quiet, calm, relaxed situation, there's no pressure on the athlete, and they have, 10, 20 opportunities to continually practice, and over time in that block practice sort of mode, they're getting a lot of practice and they're starting to achieve lots and lots. But then if we change the scenario, like you said, to a more of a randomized practice session where they might get 2 shots, then they go into some dribbling or some defensive drills or some game sense stuff, and then come back for their free throws. Often that randomized practice will have poorer results in training, but you identify longer term success. Why does this occur? What's this this phenomenon?
Yeah.
How does it happen?
Yeah, that's great. You bring that point up. I mean, this really, what you're talking about, or this example, we're distinguishing between sort of a more blocked repetitive practice and some more variable random conditions, is sort of the prototypical example of these dissociations you get between what you see now in practice, or what we call performance, and what you see if you measure learning after a rest period, typically days. And that distinction between blocked and random practice is referred to as the contextual interference effect, which has received a lot of attention in the motor learning literature. With it's a pretty robust finding, but there are relative degrees of success, and somewhat, I think that depends on the type of athlete that is being studied. And, because random practice for an individual who is at a lower skill level now is, in terms of functional difficulty, quite high. And so it's appropriate to sort of scale the difficulties to the individual. The idea between, I mean, there's a few really, but I suppose that the critical ideas behind differences between random and block practice is related to sort of these effortful planning processes that are engaged when you do more random practice, when you're switching between different skills. There's a few theories, but sort of the essence is that you're having to sort of continually recall one skill, and then quote unquote forget it while you recall the second skill, and then go back to it. And that continual switching between skills is really beneficial for learning processes, for encoding that information and aiding its subsequent retrieval. So random practice is good sort of cognitively for learning, but it also, back to perhaps the previous question, is often much more representative of what's required in the game. from that example in basketball, you are very rarely going to be asked to do 20 shots. Never actually 20 shots in a row in a basketball game. So you're now losing that sort of transfer specificity to whatever situation you're going to be tested in.
Hi listeners, a quick halftime note before we continue. If you haven't looked at the Elite Performance Journal's Coach's Notepad or the Athlete Journals yet, make sure you get onto their website, eliteperformancejournal.com, and check them out. The Athlete Journals and Coaching Notepads are designed by elite athletes and coaches and are a great tool to add to your team's arsenal. Listeners to the Coach Doctor podcast have access to a 20% discount on APJ products by using the code word Coach Doctor, which is all one word and all in lowercase, to receive the discount when you're at the checkout. Okay, let's get back to the interview. Is it the old school, let's line up and do 20 shots or take, is there still a need for that sort of training for coaches, or do you think that we need to sort of move away from that completely, or is it still, a little bit of that is okay from time to time?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So in the challenge point framework, the extended one, we've introduced sort of specificity as a dimension that we kind of superimpose with challenge, and really, sorry to be a bit jargony here, but basically the idea is that you want to keep on that high specificity end of practice, moderate to high specificity end of practice, meaning what you do has to transfer, right? That always has to be the goal of what you're doing. So if you're in a zone where what you're doing has very little relationship to what's going to happen in the game environment, then it's questionable why you're doing it. Now, so that's where I would start, is can you move it more into the zone where it's like the environment where it's going to be actually needed? That's always the question. And then that usually means it's not going to look like very blocked practice, but I think there's room to play around a bit there. And we're talking about learning goals here. So if the goal is learning and improvement, which often is, but not always is, then you want to be more on that higher specificity end and probably out of that blocked repetitive zone. However, we've talked about motivation and the need to maintain current skills and reinforce and maybe get more automaticity. I think then you can play around a bit more with repetition if learning is not necessarily your goal there, but sort of enhancing confidence and perhaps even enjoyment if it is more enjoyable to do things over and over again. But I definitely, for learning, your eye always has to be on the specificity of those processes and those links between what you're going to see in the environment and what you're going to do are really strongly maintained.
Yeah. So from the challenge point framework, from that perspective, that fits in with a higher contextual interference effect. More generally, you want to have more randomized, more variability in your practice compared to more blocked practice.
Yes, the challenge point framework was just about learning. Let's take the research we know, and it was highly influenced by research on contextual interference, as well as some of the research on sort of reducing the amount of feedback you give in practice. And so the optimal challenge point was always an optimal challenge point for learning. When Keith and I wrote the 2022 paper, we considered other goals of practice that may not just be about learning. And, this somewhat was influenced by the consideration of motivation and also by the consideration of transfer specificity. And, knowing that especially perhaps in high-level performance environments, I'm not really sure how much time is actually spent on sort of growth training and much more on maintaining current skills and working towards sort of making sure that your opposition, that transfer goal. what's the upcoming opposition going to look like? How are we going to train to play, in this hot weather, humid conditions on this playing surface, under these demands? Sort of less so than the growth. So that's where that comes in. But you're absolutely right. The challenge point framework, if we're just talking about challenges for learning, that's really, you would want to have a higher level of challenge that typically is brought around by perhaps something like random practice.
Okay. So a lot of coaches have the saying that perfect practice makes perfect, or practice makes perfect. With that thought in mind, do teams need to invariably get practice correct and always finish on a good one or a good final rep? And how does this philosophy work within that challenge-based training program?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I suppose I would disagree with the idea of perfect practice. Absolutely, because I think that's the fundamental antithesis probably of what growth, practice for learning, challenge in practice is necessary for. To your point though about whether you can finish on a high, I'm not really sure what the research would say here, but I think from a psychological perspective, it doesn't necessarily have to finish on a low note if you're engaging in sort of that more challenging practice. You can sandwich that type of practice in with something that's maybe that's easier or more rewarding at the end, if you want people to leave feeling competent and confident. And especially, on leading up to an important competition, you're probably decreasing the amount of practice that's designed for learning, so that you are making sure that you have players who are ready and confident and competent to perform. But the idea of perfect practice, no. If you were seeing no messiness, tidy, high performance, then you're not in a learning zone. I think that's just a good indication that if you're trying to improve, and most of the time, let's face it, that's the job for skill development, or in a lot of environments, maybe not at the highest, but if it's about skill development and it's looking tidy and everyone's doing things well, then I think that should be a signal that there's something wrong.
Yeah. Okay.
And yeah,
looking at it from another angle, I've been in a lot of coaching environments where the coaches have counted the number of errors and they've said, we've had this many dropped passes, and that's not good enough.
Right.
Where do you, and I don't know if you can answer this, but where is the line drawn between the coach is not happy with the players because they're not mentally switched on, and then that's why they're making the errors, or the other end of the spectrum, they're making errors because the training is challenging, which is a good thing, and they're going to be developing and learning from that? Is there, again, I don't know, I'm sort of a bit of a left field question.
Excellent question. No, I think it's an excellent question, and probably that's where the coach's expertise really matters, in addition to making sure that the coach and the athletes know what the purpose of the practice is. So if you're in a zone of practice or a part of practice where it's about playing your best, we're preparing for the competition, I want you to show me what you can do, then there shouldn't be room for errors. In fact, you might want to have some consequences for errors, because in the game, of course, there's consequences if you muck up. So if we want to maximize transfer, maybe we need to bring in some of those consequences into our practice. If the goal is one of learning, and it may be just not for the whole team, it may just be for one or two individuals, that you want them doing something that they don't normally do, or paying attention to information that's not usually their consideration because they're so focused of scoring a goal, rather than maybe making sure that their positioning, higher up the field is the best positioning. So under those situations, I think that's where the errors mean something else now, that they shouldn't be considered a signal that people are not paying attention and are not performing. But I imagine that's an art to be able to pick that up, which would be facilitated by clear goals and communication.
Okay. So again, coaches being able to communicate the goals of the session or the goals of that activity to the players, so that the pressure or the thought processes around what they're going to be doing isn't going to be constrained by, if I make a mistake, I'll get dropped, or if I do this wrong, we won't win on the weekend, or it won't transfer across to the weekend's performance. Okay. Going back to the functional difficulty, if you've got a team and you've got a group of players, and from player 1 to player 10, their overall skill level is quite variable, and probably doesn't happen so much in elite teams, but probably in junior teams, you might have 2 or 3 star players and then some beginners or novices down the other end of the team. As the coach, how can you develop your challenges or your challenge point to meet the needs of all of the players? Is there a technique or a way that we can do this?
If I knew it, I'd write a book on it. No, actually, this is a problem for team sports, of course, and the idea of deliberate practice that Anders Ericsson really pushed forward with some colleagues as well, but that originally came from music, and where you could really consider time spent in practice as being individualized. You could count it much more easily and quantify the quality of that practice too. Now, that's been a difficulty, trying to measure team sport practice and what part of that practice is quality practice. I mean, I think personally, it may be this exercise of, okay, where as the team are we weakest, and what do we need to improve on? That's some consideration, and then having some goals about how we prioritize those weaknesses, and that might help identify particular players or positions where effort should be focused. Or it may be that and I suppose this is a problem in teaching generally. Do you facilitate those at a higher level to get even better and make sure that they're actually challenged, or do you make sure that those who are at the lower level get up to that average of the rest of the group? Hopefully you have more than one coach and you can be doing both at the same time, because we talked about motivation. You don't want to be under challenged, you don't want to be over challenged. So that's an issue that you have to face anyway. I don't know what the numbers are. It's interesting if you look at the literature, like what should be this optimal amount of success versus failures, and that's sometimes very difficult to quantify what a success even looks like, or what a failure even looks like in many sports. But the ranges there are really wide. Everything from sort of like down the low level, that as long as you're getting 10% successes, that's okay, up to sort of 85-90%. So it's not like even the research literature could offer a good lens right now in terms of how much should we let people fail before they're not learning or not motivated to continue with the sport. But I mean, of course, coaches understand that engagement is critical. We know from a learning perspective that you need to be attending and there has to be concentration. So there's also interesting research in the gaming literature, actually, that it's not so much about success, but you just need to know that it's attainable. I think they call this like positive failures. these nearly there. I almost got it. And that, as long as people are nearly there, I think they're okay. They'll stay with it. They'll keep doing it. It's when it's unattainable that's when you're losing people.
Okay. And when you referred to the gaming literature, referring to like computer games and
yes,
yeah.
the video game literature.
Yeah. I think that's a great analogy because, as someone, I don't play a lot of computer games, but I have in the past, and just going back to thinking about that, you get these sections in computer games where you almost pass a certain level or you beat the bad person in the game, but you keep losing just at the end there, and you put your controller down and say, I'm done, I'm not going to do it anymore. And then 2 minutes later you're back there trying again. It's got this, it's almost like addictive that you want to try and beat this challenge and get to the next level. And once you've achieved that, it's right, oh great, and then you tend to be able to do it more regularly once you've achieved it once. And I guess it goes back to that learning with challenges. Once you've achieved something and you keep repeating that over and over again, you're not going to develop your skills a lot more until the challenge is then increased again. So
sorry for interrupting you, James. Yeah, but that's how games are designed, isn't it, as well? Like you say, they have these levels of difficulty built into them, to really keep you there. And and you might not only just sort of not achieve, and then you achieve, and then okay, now what's next? And then you're going to go back through that same process again, and the difficulties keep getting scaled in a way that's adaptive, it's dynamic, and it keeps you engaged because there's money to be made out of you being engaged in this. It matters to the designers. There's a lot of thought that goes into how can we keep you doing this for as long as possible.
Yeah. So coaches almost got to think about setting up their training sessions like computer games.
Yeah, you said that.
Moving on to the last part of the questions, you propose the challenge-based method can be used in 3 practice types. And I just thought I'd try and get a bit of explanation to what each of these are. First one is practice to transfer, then practice to learn, and then practice to maintain. What do you mean by these 3 practice types?
You were sort of touched on them as we've gone through the conversation. And it was mainly bore out of conversations when, I have tried to engage with practitioners and done some consultancy work that I was, kind of really aware that a lot of the practice actually isn't spent designing practice to bring about learning, particularly in these high performance environments. And a lot of the time it is spent about preparing for the opposition, preparing for this game environment. So in trying to do a framework that's, maybe it's sometimes a little bit too broad, but just a sort of conceptualization way of thinking it, that we were wanted to say that sometimes the design of challenges is really about maximizing transfer goals, that you are bringing in things like getting people to perform something difficult, maybe closer to the end of practice when they're fatigued. That that the first 5 minutes is highly anxiety inducing in perhaps a game environment. So how can you mimic those demands in your practice environment? In getting that crowd noise, making people start the play after they've just, finished running around the track or whatever it is, so that they're already in an uncomfortable zone to start the game. I mentioned consequences, that if you make mistakes in a competition environment, they have consequences. So can you design your practice in a way that has consequences too for failures? And you can see this is quite different to how you would design challenges for learning, where in one case you want to prevent seeing errors, another case you expect to see errors. that was the transfer piece, really designing ways of preparing the challenges to match the level of opposition and competition. Learning, we've spoken about, that's really the essence of the challenge point framework. It's sort of this more practice for growth, that you are bringing in challenges that are thought to have some costs to short-term performance, what you see now, but over time, you're expecting to see learning. And then maintenance practice, that should still be sort of specific to what the competition environment, but in terms of functional difficulty, in terms of the individual difficulty, it's really about playing to your players' strengths, that you are in a reinforcement zone, you're maintaining that current level, you're making sure things work, you maybe developing more automaticity in skills. So it's sort of these smaller kind of refinements rather than more learning new skills.
Okay. And is there a percentage that you should be spending in each practice type, or does it depend on type of time of the season, the age or the level of the team, and a whole other number of factors?
I don't know the answer. And I it's a question that I wish I could be more prescriptive about. You're probably right, it depends. It has to depend. And of course, if the day before a game, I think more time should be spent in transfer and much less time, if any, in that learning zone. But if you're dealing with kids, you're a grassroots coach and you have 11-year-olds, then surely most of the practice must be about skill development. Now, that said, no one wants to continue playing if they're going to lose every game. So I know we have to work on winning and, playing as a team, and that may, not be great for your own skill development, because we're just going to you're such a great kicker that your role is to always be in this position at the back and making sure that you can, take the goal kicks for the goalie, because that's more likely that we're going to win the game if you're playing defense. Now, that's going to be opposed to perhaps the development of that player, where challenges would be better to make them into a more attacking fullback. Or, sorry, I keep giving soccer examples.
That's right.
Yeah, I'm sure we could talk about other sports. You can see where my comfort zone is talking about soccer. So yes, that has to depend, but in terms of numbers, I don't want to say.
Okay, no, that's fine. Obviously that's going to change and depend on a whole heap of things. So I think we've come to the end of the questions that I'd already set up, and I just wanted to also ask: were there any aspects of the challenge-based framework that I haven't mentioned today that you think are also really important for practitioners to consider when they're using the challenge-based framework?
No, I think we've covered most of the points there. I mean, the original challenge point framework is really making sure that distinction between performance and learning, which I think we've talked about quite a bit here. The importance of specificity to that transfer environment. So always questioning, does it look like the game? And I think in recent times, a lot more emphasis has been put on what they call sort of play-in form versus training form. And so, that's an important aspect. Balancing sort of motivational costs and difficulties. The psychological aspects are obviously as important as sort of informational aspects. And putting those all together, I think just reinforces the kind of critical principles for perhaps a coach to follow who has this learning mindset, clear communication, and then also just interrogating what are they learning? I mean, I sometimes think, sometimes technology, or, you watch someone do this really cool practice drill and you're like, oh yeah, I'm going to do that. And then, but why? Like, what is it that you think that they're really learning here by doing this game or using this device, or and what's the evidence? Can I measure that? Is there any way that I can find out actually, are they learning it? If I think this is going to build, better touch on the ball, it's going to build better decision making. How can I get evidence over time that that's actually what it's doing? And sometimes you can use a bit of common sense. Like, if it doesn't look and feel like the game environment, then that's a reason to question its validity in being a good practice tool. Just because everybody else is using it doesn't mean it's any good. And I know people have jumped on these latest, so anything that's got brain or neuro in the title, people think, right, that's going to improve performance. And Manchester United are using it, so we have to use it too. But I think sometimes it's just about people thinking, oh, well, there's a magic pill I can buy, or I can afford that, I'll get that, and the players are going to have a bit more variety in what practice looks like. So why not? What's the downside of this? I think there are downsides to that, because, of course, once one person buys into it, then everybody else does, and people who can't afford it. And then there's a trade-off, because you're spending time doing things that are not only ineffective, but are taken away from time that could be spent doing effective practice, which is an issue.
Yeah, great
anyway,
point.
I feel like I'm sorry, going on there.
I just want to go back. You when you talked about specificity, would games-based practice be more important for a challenge-based environment, or is there still room for more some blocked, some drill-based practice? Because we can still add some difficulties to those, but does games-based better suit the model?
Not necessarily, but it could, I suppose. So I think there is a tension somewhat between maximizing specificity to the environment and getting repetitions. If you really maximize specificity, like the example we gave earlier of the free throw shot, maybe you only get 2 attempts, and so there are ways maybe where you want to try and keep the critical cues of the game as much as you can and simplify it. So again, in soccer, of course, there are small-sided games, maybe 3-on-3. You still have the decision component there, but it is going to be different decision component than if you were playing 11v11. And so then it's the game. What's your goal with this drill? Like, what are you really trying to work on in perceiving opportunities for a gap and an attack? Can that be done at a smaller level and you can get multiple repetitions? Then maybe you should be doing that. So it's like the game, but it's further down that specificity continuum, because what you're trying to do is isolate more of the opportunities to practice the thing you want to work on for that particular player, maybe, for instance.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think it can move more drill-like, but as long as you're still getting the fundamental skill that looks like what it does in competition.
All right. Last point that I thought about. If a team, so I'm putting on my coach's hat now, if my team got beaten, 3 or 4 weeks in a row, I get to training and I have a challenge-based program or training session planned. Am I better off making it easier for the motivational costs so that the players develop more confidence in that setting, and when they start becoming more successful, then starting to increase the challenges again? Or I'm just thinking now in terms of their mindset. Is it good to sort of dabble in changing the desirable difficulties to meet, I guess, their emotional requirements as well?
Yeah, that's a good question on a number of fronts, really, I think, because it may be that the lack of winning is because the learning part is just not showing up yet. You want them to stick with it. Maybe they're trying the things that you're working on at practice, and it's taking time. And if you in individual sports, it's easier to conceptualize, where golfers or people in tennis, they try and relearn their technique because eventually that's going to be more effective and efficient. But they might have some short-term costs there. So I suppose if there is maybe other metrics beyond performance outcomes that could be used to say, look, I know we're not winning, but hey, you made more passes this game, and we kept the ball we had more possession. Other metrics that may speak to learning, that would be a good thing. Yet, it may be that you'd want to scale back, perhaps, parts of the practice that are much more designed for improvement and growth, or for certain players, not necessarily. Again, I'm talking team sports again, but there could be some scaling that's needed so that you are helping to reinforce some of the strengths. But I would think that anyone who engages in practice at whatever level, even a master athlete, you want improvement. You don't just want to be. I think you expect it. I mean, I think you expect it magically. I'm just going to keep turning up to practice, even though I'm doing the same thing over and over again. I expect that I'm going to improve. And sometimes I interrogate it and I think, actually, I'm just as good as I was 10 years ago. Yeah. Why is that? Why am I not improving? Okay, well, as long as there's that mindset from somebody, at least at the coach, and perhaps it's communicated, that actually by turning up to practice and doing things you can already do, you're just going to be as good as you always were. Let's now turn up to practice and, hey, let's make you better. I mean, because then you're going to keep playing, you're going to feel good about yourself, all those motivational benefits are going to come through enhanced competence. So it should be a win-win.
Okay. Awesome. What a great note to finish off on. And Professor Nikki Hodges, I really appreciate you giving up some time today. It's the afternoon, I think, in Canada at the moment. So thank you so much. It's been a really interesting chat, and I'm sure that any listeners and coaches that listen to this podcast will get a lot out of it. So I really, really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, James. It's been great chatting with you.
Thank you. Okay, being someone who does a lot of reading in this field and has previously published research in this field, I was like a kid in a candy store speaking to Professor Hodges. I previously read a lot of her work and refer to it as well. For someone so knowledgeable on the subject, she also came across as so modest and keen to share her ideas and discuss the ideas. I took away a great deal from this conversation. One is that using a challenge-based framework requires communication from the coach. This method of practice tends to produce more errors in training, and the motivational costs can be higher if athletes keep failing. When using this framework, be certain to communicate with the athletes that this practice activity is designed to push them and will likely result in a higher number of errors. Make them feel comfortable to make errors rather than being stressed that mistakes might cost them a position in the team, for example. Reducing anxiety will hopefully improve the engagement of the athletes and make them more willing to try things they might not have previously done. Further to this, motivational costs can also be associated with a lack of challenge. We all get bored doing things that don't challenge us, and training in this way can lead to a lack of motivation as well. So just be aware of that. The question I was desperate to ask Nikki was, how much challenge is the right amount? The answer is, how long is a piece of string? It really depends on your group, their age, their level, the time of the season you're in, at the time of the week even. This is something as a coach you need to determine for your group as you move through the season, but please ensure you do provide some challenge, as this is where most growth occurs. Finally, providing a challenge-based framework is not something that you require all the time. There is still a place for other training modalities, just like there is room for both blocked and random practice, games and drills. But as previously mentioned, Nikki identifies challenge with the most growth in learning and development. So make sure training is not always designed for perfect practice. As a coach, embrace errors and encourage growth through challenges with your teams and athletes. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation, because I know I did. If you would like to gain access to some of Nikki's research, including the challenge-based paper we discussed today, I've included the link to the Motor Skills Lab in the show notes and the Twitter handle, which updates with new information and research regularly. In the meantime, as usual, please like the episode and share it with your fellow coaches and friends. And until next time, keep learning.